Last Christmas, one of the most popular gifts were those genealogy kits, where you could send in a DNA sample and discover whether your ancestors were Joan of Arc or Jack the Ripper. I'm not sure why it is everybody imagines that they are an ancestor of someone great and famous. But the fact of the matter is, all of you are in fact ancestors of someone great and famous. Me. I am your too many to count times great grandmother. My name is Eve. I decided to wear my fig leaves over the pastor's robe this morning because I really did not want to skeeve you out by coming to church wearing nothing but fig leaves. Pardon me a minute. Let me remind you that one of my claims to fame as the mother of all humanity results I want to expose myself to you. Resulted not from anything wonderful that I did, but rather as the result of a very poor choice that I made. You know the story in Scripture. God created Adam, a Hebrew word that means man. And Adam was tasked with naming all the animals, but afterwards complained to God that all the animals had mates one with the other, except him. There was no one found like him. So God put him into a deep sleep, removed one of his ribs, and formed me. And then brought me to Adam, who saw me in all my glory, and said, "At last, here is one who is like me. I will call her woman, because she was taken from the man." And for some time, our life was pretty good. We were able to enjoy a honeymoon, as it were, in the garden. And in the cool of the evening, the Lord would come down and visit with us, and we'd go for walks in the garden and talk about all that had been done for us that day. But you know the story. A serpent came along, tempted me, offered me the opportunity to become like God, knowing good and evil. And he led me to a tree in the garden that had beautiful looking fruit. Now, I don't know why you North Americans, Western European Christians, continue to believe that I ate an apple that day. There are no apple trees in the Middle East. Chances are it was a pomegranate or some other sweet-tasting fruit. I know it was a sweet-tasting fruit because it looked good and it smelled good, and when I tasted it, it tasted good. And Adam was there with me. I offered some of this fruit to him, and he ate. And you know what happened after that? It's like when you're sitting in your classroom and the teacher has stepped out and the class goes a little crazy, and all of a sudden you realize that the teacher is standing in the doorway. Or maybe when you were small, you were misbehaving. Somehow I imagine the Kelly boys as small children being impish and mischievous, only to discover you, Sister Nancy, standing in the doorway, the face of doom and destruction. Maybe you girls can tell me afterwards what it was like for the two of you growing up. I've got a hunch you were the good girl, Claudia, and your sister there was the one who was always getting into trouble.
No.
No, she says. Well, here's the thing. When you get into trouble, when you realize you've disappointed God, when you realize that you've sinned, there are some things that you should not do. And the first of them is, don't try to hide. Adam and I did that. We tried to hide from God. We foolishly believed we could find a place where we could go where the Lord would not be able to find us. Hello? He created the world. Do you really think there was some place we could go where we could hide from God? The book of Hebrews says, there is no place where you can hide from God, for his eyes see everything that we do. And we must give an answer to God for the things that we have done. Jonah tried running away from God, thinking that if God told him to go east and he went west, God would go looking for him in the east and never find him because he wasn't there. You know that story. Out there on the water, God found him. Of course, his attempt was rather silly, but we do the same things sometimes, don't we? We try to hide the things that we have done. Another thing we try to do is cover it up. Adam and I did that. We were ashamed of our nakedness, yet when we were created, we were as innocent as children. And I don't know about you, members of Grace, but there's probably no better example of freedom and innocence than a small child that has taken off all his clothes and is now running naked down the sidewalk with you in desperate pursuit with a blanket in your arms. God forbid people see us as we really are. But that's what we tried to do. We took these fig leaves and we tried to cover ourselves. Our third option was to play the victim card. Adam blamed me. I blamed the serpent. Adam says it wasn't his fault. God, it's your fault. This is the woman that you gave me. She's obviously defective. That's why she led me astray. And I tried to pass it off and say, it's not my fault. The serpent twisted my mind and led me to make poor decisions. Today we hear people today who try to shift the blame for their actions. They say, it's in my genes. That's part of my genetic makeup to lie or steal or to do drugs. It's not my fault. Or we'll say, I grew up in a bad environment with parents who didn't love and nurture me. I was not breastfed long enough, and that's why I have a need to go out and join a gang. Or we'll even say it's the devil's fault. The devil tempted us, and we gave in to that temptation. You know, it doesn't matter what your genetic makeup is. It doesn't matter the environment in which you grew up, or the temptations that Satan might throw at you. Sin is still sin. Sin is still a choice. Try shifting the blame on the day of judgment and see how far that gets you. The last thing we might try to do is fix ourselves before God. They believe that if they find the right philosophy or the right lifestyle, they'll be able to make their lives better. I remember going into a bookstore one day and asking the clerk where the self-help books were. And the clerk said, "Find them yourself." But if you look into the self-help section of any bookstore, you'll see that the shelves are packed with all kinds of books that tell you how to fix yourself. And if you're too lazy to do that, just turn on your television and let the ladies of the truth explain to you how things should go. Or watch Dr. Phil, or even Judge Judy, to tell you how you should live your life. But people seem to think that having knowledge is the key to a good relationship with God. You know, the Pharisees, my ancestors, my descendants, tried that. Guess I didn't have any ancestors. I didn't even have a mother. Maybe that's why I sinned. I didn't have a loving mother. But the Pharisees believed that if they could apply enough rules and regulations in their lives and follow them, that would make God happy. Now, we try to do that too, don't we? Or you try to do that too. I'm in your history. God's got to love me because I go to church every Sunday. God's got to love me because I lead a pretty good life and I don't hurt other people. But the fact is, you can't stack up brownie points with God. For everyone on earth is a sinner. Everyone on earth is in need of salvation. And there are some things that you can do about this sinful condition. The first is, you can turn to the Lord. You know, not much is written in Scripture about what happened to Adam and I after we left the garden. Haven't you wondered about that? Where did we go? What did we do? I guess the people who put the Bible together decided those stories were not worth including. But that doesn't mean those stories don't exist. In fact, here are some of the stories that were actually written about Adam and I after we got kicked out of the garden. One of them says that we mourned for months following our disgraceful event. We couldn't cope with what happened in the garden. And so we spent the rest of our lives emotionally and psychologically distraught. And when you consider that we lived some 900 years, that's a pretty long depression. There are some stories that said we went 80 days refusing to eat, figuring that if God saw how emaciated we were becoming, He would have mercy on us. And restore us to the garden. Obviously, my fig leaves are not working. There's one more story that said Adam became so depressed that he threw himself over a cliff with the idea that God would start over again. And one other story that Adam and I separated and went in different directions, which meant we never procreated. We never had children. We never populated the earth. And so God was forced to wait until we died and then start over with a new creation. Did any of these stories really happen? No. It's National Enquirer kind of stuff. Right up there with Elvis being seen at Rite Aid yesterday, standing in the checkout line behind the dog-faced boy. Now, actually, I have no intention of telling you what happened to Adam and I after we left the garden, because it's not necessary that you know. But I will tell you, we decided to live. We decided to go on and realize that we had done something wrong, but that the sun would continue to rise each morning and a new day would begin. And we could sit and feel sorry for ourselves, or we could get on with life. We chose to do that. Now maybe some of you find yourself in a pit of despair or depression or sadness. And you too can be tempted to sit and feel sorry for yourself and be gloomy. Or you can realize that as God did for Adam and I, God gave you a new day this morning, even if it did start an hour earlier than yesterday did. Personally, I intend to take an hour-long nap this afternoon and catch up for that hour. But you can sit and wallow in your despair, or you can pick yourselves up, accept God's merciful forgiveness, and move on with your lives. We decided to accept God's covering. No, not fig leaves, but rather his grace and his presence in our lives. For we soon realized that even though we could no longer live in the kind of harmony we had in the garden, God had not abandoned us. I bet there are times when you feel unlovable, when you feel you have done something so foul and detestable that no one could ever forgive you and no one could ever love you. But yet don't parents continue to love their children even when they're disobedient? God continued to love Adam and I even though we had disobeyed him and done the one thing we were told not to do. Imagine that. We had free reign of the entire garden. Only needed to avoid one tree. And we couldn't do that. But yet God still covered us with his love and sent us forward in our lives. We resisted the devil. Because don't think that that was the one and only time he tempted us. Think of the gospel lesson you heard this morning, where Satan spent 40 days testing Jesus in the wilderness. But then when he departed, it was with the intent to return at an opportune time. Satan can strike you when you're feeling down and unloved. But Satan can also tempt you when you're feeling in love with yourself and thinking yourself to be so good and so successful and so content that you don't need God. One last thing Adam and I did. We chose to build an altar life. Not A-L-T-E-R, but A-L-T-A-R. Altar. Such as the table behind me in the chancel area. Symbolically, an altar is a place where God and the children of God meet. And so this morning, as you gather here today, you come into the presence of God's altar. It's an opportunity. You heard a lesson that talked about giving God the first fruits of your life. In reality, that's a stewardship talk. And people sometimes wonder, how much do I have to give to the church? I even had a parishioner ask Pastor Ken one time, my tithe to the church, is that based on my gross or net income? You decide that. Because it's not how much you have to give, it's how much you get to give. It's how much you choose to give in gratefulness to God for your blessings. Or even the fact that you're sitting here this morning. Think back to when you were a child and your parents were getting you ready for school or for church on Sunday morning, not even school during the week. Do I have to go? That's the wrong question to ask. The better question is, Mom, Dad, do I get to go to church this morning? I was glad when they said to me, let's go to the house of the Lord. Coming here is not a duty or an obligation. It's an opportunity to worship God. I may not be able to live in Eden anymore, but God made it possible for me to have an abundant life. And in one of his Gospels, Jesus tells you that he came into this world so that you might have life and have it abundantly. As I close this morning, remember that while there are times when you are displeasing to God, God never stops loving you. God will always be there with his mercy and his amazing grace to forgive and to restore you. Amen. Amen. We worship God with our offering.